Hey everyone, welcome back to another installment in our virtual education and self isolation series. Today, I'm going to be sharing the second half of my presentation, What is Fremont? I'm Elizabeth Hora, and I'm public archaeologist here at the Utah State Historic Preservation Office. So today, we're continuing our discussion of Fremont archaeology from the perspective of potentially actual people. And guys, I'm just giving you a heads up, today's going to get pretty touchy-feely. So in review, I'm going to start off with a quick sketch of the Fremont. Then we'll fill in the two economic modes that shaped Fremont lifeways. So the Fremont lived in much of modern-day Utah between about 400 AD and 1300 AD. Within that period of time and within that large swath of space, people engaged in a lot of different lifeways. The huge variation in how people lived can sometimes make it difficult to conceptualize who these people were. So I like this artist's sketch because it has actual people in it. People are interacting with the artifacts and architecture that we talked about last time. Archaeologists call these physical remains material culture, and the Fremont's material culture reflects the two different ends of a spectrum we're calling the farmer-forager spectrum. Once you can understand the farmer-forager spectrum, you can start to really understand the Fremont. The farmer-forager spectrum is describing two economic systems, one in which people stay in one place and farm, and one in which people move around a lot more and forage. So if you recall from last time, the farmer-forager spectrum organized a lot of the material culture that we see at Fremont sites. Whether you were residentially mobile or not would color the decisions you make in your living quarters, kinds of items you used every day, where you disposed of your trash, and how and where you stored your extra goods. So last time we described the two ends of this spectrum in detail. And today I want to spend more time thinking about this middle area. And this is where we can start putting faces to some of these artifacts and archaeological sites. So who is farming, who is foraging, and who is flip-flopping between the two? So the Fremont varied their economic mode between foraging and farming, not just on the basis of location and not just during certain periods of time, but an individual person would move between farming and foraging maybe multiple times during the course of their lifetime. So on the screen are popping up a few of the conditions that could encourage an individual person to take up farming or to hit the open road and forage. So I really want to explore this space, and we're going to take a little bit of a flight of fancy here for the rest of the presentation. I want to use historical and modern photographs of people to help you put yourself in the position of a prehistoric person who is moving between these economic modes of foraging and farming and finding the space in between. So the two examples we're going to run through are just storytelling devices that will help us envision a world unlike our own. I am not saying that these two people are anyone from the past that I know about. I'm going to talk about two different people who are farmers and foragers, and I'm going to use the trajectory of these two possible human lives to talk about how people may have lived. So that disclaimer aside, let's explore the Fremont world. First, let's think about the Fremont through a farmer's eyes. Our first example is going to be the life of a girl. Let's say she was born in the northern Uinta Basin around 500 AD. And you can see I've got home marked here in the upper part of the Uinta Basin. You can see that, we've got all this green agricultural land from the modern period. And honestly, if we had a satellite back in Fremont times, it might have looked pretty similar. You might have seen, lush green agricultural swaths like that. So this girl was born into a village that had nearby fields of corn, beans, and squash fed through irrigation canals. When she was young, she would help her mom and dad clear debris from these canals, and as she got older, she would spend her summer mornings weeding. As a child, her life was probably a lot like yours was as a child. You watch your parents go about their daily chores, and eventually you take over more and more responsibility. This kid probably broke her fair share of water oyas and bowls, like the one pictured down here, but she probably learned to repair them, hoping that would deflect some of the punishment. And we do see sometimes these bowls with two drill holes on either side of a big crack or break. And we call those repair holes because you could wind some leather in between the two holes and help to reseal that crack. So as she gets older, she and another boy in the village draw closer together. In her late teen years, they decide to marry, and he moves in with her family for the first year of their marriage. They spend that year getting to know each other and building a house on the edge of her parents' fields. By the time they're ready to move into their new home together after that first year, she's made rabbit skin blankets, like the one pictured here on the left, and juniper bark mats to make the place cozy and comfortable. Her husband, meanwhile, has been making a name for himself, say as a good doctor and a healer, and it's up to her to provide most of the food for her young family, which isn't a problem because her family's fields are doing great. They have a quiet, happy, successful life. As they grow older and their kids move out, her husband maybe spends more and more time away in other villages practicing his craft. She spends most of her time playing with her grandkids, showing them how to make rabbit snares. Maybe that's a specialty of hers. Despite her husband's medicines, her arthritis is slowing her down, and her daughter's family is doing most of the farming for them in later years, really taking care of their elders. Now an old woman, she's a pillar of the community. She's been around for so long that she can remember when the cottonwood trees on the outskirts of the village were just little sprouts. And the lived wisdom of her years she passes on down to the next generations through stories and through songs. And I love these photos of people who are, learning stories and songs together over here. And then Mary Jane Goggles is actually, she lived on the Wind River Reservation up in Wyoming. And I loved this photo of just how proud she was. She looks like she's had an awesome time in life. So that's example number one, a farmer staying in one place. But you could see that there was a depth and a texture to her life. Let me scoot back, that some of the artifacts, can really help you understand. We have this beautiful cradle board with a kid, and it just really shows how much people love their families. And that kid's going to spend a couple minutes in that cradle board, so you got to make it comfy, right? You got to make it something that you want to carry and something that the kid's going to. I just love the texture of lives that archaeological artifacts provide us. And these historical photographs do a great job of helping us envision how people lived with these artifacts. So next, we're going to look at the Fremont through a forager's eyes. We're going to spend a little more time on this because I think this is a little harder for some of us. So we're going to imagine a little boy. This little boy grows up in a village, but a smaller village on the shores of Utah Lake. And you can see I'm pointing here down around, modern day Payson, but picture it wherever you like on the Utah Lake shores. So we're setting the scene at about 1250 AD. So this is going to be near the end of the Fremont era. He's raised in one of the small hamlets along a small tributary leading into the lake, and his family has a nice plot of land for corn, beans, and squash. But from an early age, he loves hunting waterfowl on the marshes nearby. Once he's old enough to sit quietly in their bulrush or tule, their bulrush boat, he accompanies his dad and his uncle on their early morning hunts. The older men set out their duck lures and wait for waterfowl to alight on the marshes. And once the birds venture close enough, the three of them quickly send off a volley of arrows in that direction. After repeating this a few more times, they'll head home with enough ducks for their family, plus a couple of spare birds to trade. Here we've got an example of this tule or bulrush duck. This is a duck decoy that people would make, and we had a few of them found in Nevada in Lovelock Cave. But we expect that they were used to cross the Great Basin probably since the archaic times. And you would actually have a duck that you've skinned, and you would pull and sew that feathered skinned duck over this bulrush duck. You set out a few of them, and that's a pretty nice hunting lure, right? Ducks will come hang out on the marshes thinking that everything's calm and peaceful. Um, so continuing on with this boy's story though, their village is small and there's really only a few families in it, but they're anything but isolated. A few times a year, mostly in the winters, their village can double in size as travelers arrive. These travelers are almost always relatives, sometimes distant relatives, and they bring with them jewelry, stories, news of the world, good materials for making tools, and, of course, game meat. And here we have one last thing. Here we have a woman who is collecting pinyon seeds. This is a modern photograph, obviously. This was taken just a few years ago. Pinyon nuts are a really important staple since the archaic period in people's diets, and we're going to talk about those shortly. So this little boy grows up idolizing these travelers. By the time he's 14 or 15, he's pestering his parents about taking trips with them. He's been out with his dad and uncle. He's, been out camping before. He's made a living, kind of camping out with his dad and his uncle, maybe hunting mule deer nearby. They've gone up to that winter retreat where you're going to gather pinyon nuts, like this woman is doing. He feels like he's ready. When his mom's brother next comes to town, he's one of those travelers, everyone agrees that it's time for this boy to experience a longer excursion. So he goes out and he goes west and south with his uncle out into the desert. He travels with a group of a couple dozen people who walk on foot from place to place, staying in each camp for only a few days, or maybe for a week or two. Oftentimes, they camp near another village, and sometimes more people will join their group. Sometimes people will leave their group and stay in that village. Sometimes the group camps in strategic places, perhaps a quarry where members of the traveling group can collect stone for making projectile points like these to trade. Sometimes they camp in a place in the fall where they know there's good hunting, or in the winter, they camp in places with ripe pinyon seeds. And there in those winter times, they'll meet up with other groups of travelers and form kind of larger bands of people who will hang out and gather pinyon nuts together. So the boy lives like this for years, walking from place to place, eating fresh foods and meeting new people. He meets boys and girls, then men and women, who he makes deep connections with. And eventually he meets one young girl in particular. She's been traveling in the mountains with her family from their small farming village near present-day Cove Fort. And they agree, these two, that when the spring comes, he will go live with them in their small village. Matrilineal location, matrilocal location is what we call it, is something that I've touched on in both of these stories because it is really commonly practiced among many, many, many cultures and tribes and bands of the West today. So in the springtime, he goes to live with his new wife's family. And there he settles down into small town life once again. In the early years of their marriage, he and his new wife farm corn, beans, and squash together, and they have a few children. He still goes out to hunt on long trips, and on those trips, he collects things like obsidian that his family needs from the nearby mineral mountains. But his wife's family is always nearby to help them tend their garden and their small animal traps when he's out on these ventures. Over the years, they do a little bit of farming, but more often than not, they're able to find enough seasonally available fruits, vegetables, fish, birds, and rabbits. So after a few seasons, they just stop planting foods altogether. It's just not worth their time anymore. This man, his wife, and their kids now move with his wife's family and take a couple of other families with them from place to place. And whenever they're up near Utah Lake, he makes sure to stop by his old village with his family. He brings obsidian for his dad and his uncle. He brings stories for his nieces and nephews. And his wife weaves baskets with his mom. They stay for a few days, maybe a week, and then the man, his wife, and their kids pack up and rejoin their traveling group. For decades, they travel together, and they have their family-owned pinyon nut stands that they will retreat to in the winters. In the spring and summers, they move down into the valleys where you still today can find a wide variety of medicines and foods to eat. As the couple ages, their kids, who are now grown, help them carry some of their loads. They tend to stay in camp more and more, this couple, as their aches and pains catch up with them. But because they know this country like the back of their hands, they're the ones who are now planning the moves of the larger traveling group. And the younger generations always make sure that their grandparents are well cared for. Again, I love these photos because you do see those human faces. It's so nice that we have so many great photographs of women with their babies. These are always just really sweet and touching photographs. These are Southern Paiute people. And so, obviously this is a little bit later. Her hair looks like this is maybe the 1940s. But these folks are living out in wickiups that people who were traveling a lot would often use as habitation structures for a few days or a couple of weeks at a time. And you can see that there's this multi-generational household. You've got a couple of young kids and then an older man down here. So it's just a very sweet photograph. Here's my summary for these last two presentations, the one that was really well anchored in archaeology, and then this one that was more of a storytelling device. So I started thinking about this project by telling you that I understand people best by thinking about lived experiences and using archaeological data to support reconstructions of daily life. I think telling stories like these may put me in a kind of precarious place. So I want to emphasize that these stories are just devices that help me breathe life into old pots and chipped stone. So I do hope that this helps you see a little bit of maybe the people behind the artifacts. And I hope that this helps you conceptualize how something as dry and impersonal as the farming foraging spectrum actually holds the key to feeling the texture and the rhythm of prehistoric lives. And as a last aside, I also hope that when you're able to see really the people who are behind these artifacts, like the people who are in these historical photographs, creating pottery, who are in their regalia, and then some of their modern descendants from this day, I hope when you can see this, that the next time you find something outside in the wild, like this pot, you can pick it up, appreciate it for what it is, and then leave it back in its place, because that's where people left it, and that's where more people can find it to enjoy it in its original context. So thank you so much for joining me as we go through and talk about what is Fremont. And thank you all so much for joining us for all of our Archaeology and Historic Preservation Month events. We've really had a blast, and we'll see you next time.